The trail goes cold at the edge of a creek. February 13th, 2017. Delphi, Indiana. A town of roughly 3,000 people. The kind of place where everyone knows the name of the family that's lived on the corner for 40 years. Where the same faces show up at the Friday night football games and the Tuesday morning diner counter. Where the local obituaries run in the same weekly paper that prints the high school honor roll. It's a Monday. Schools are closed for the day. A teacher in service break, the kind of unexpected weekday gift that feels enormous when you're 13 or 14 years old, and suddenly the whole afternoon opens up in front of you with nowhere you have to be. Two girls decide to spend it hiking the Monon High Bridge Trail. It's a popular spot, especially on a dry winter day when the creek is running low and the bare trees open up the sky in every direction. The old railroad trestle stretches over Deer Creek, maybe 60 feet above the water, rusted iron and weathered timber that's been sitting there since the late 1800s, long after the last freight train crossed it and the tracks were pulled up and the corridor was handed back to the land. Kids from the area have walked it 100 times. Families have taken photos on it. Nothing about this particular Monday afternoon carries any warning. The air is cold, somewhere in the low 30s, but the sky is clear enough. It's the kind of afternoon that looks perfectly safe from every angle. By the time the sun drops behind the tree line, neither girl has come home. By the next morning, search teams are moving through the woods along Deer Creek, stepping carefully through frozen mud and bare underbrush, calling names into the cold air, their voices carrying through the skeletal trees and disappearing into the stillness of a February morning in central Indiana. By early afternoon on February 14th, they find what they were praying they wouldn't find. Two bodies in a wooded area close to the creek bank, less than a mile from the trailhead, partially hidden by the terrain, the cold ground around them undisturbed by anything except what had already happened there. And when investigators pull out the older girl's phone, the phone she had with her the entire time, tucked in her jacket pocket, screen dark, battery still holding charge, they find something that will define this case for years. She had been recording, audio, video. She had captured the man who killed them, walking toward them on that bridge, his voice carried on the wind above the creek. The police have his face, they have his voice, and for nearly 6 years they cannot find him. To understand how a case with this much evidence stayed unsolved for so long, and what finally broke it open, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to the afternoon of February 13th, and two girls who just wanted to spend a free day outside. Abigail Williams was 13 years old. Her family called her Abby. She was in 8th grade at Delphi Community Middle School, a low brick building on Armory Road that sits at the center of a town where the school calendar is the town calendar, where the Friday night basketball games draw half the county, and the hallways on Monday morning are full of the same conversations that happened at the diner over the weekend. Abby was the kind of student her teachers remembered. Curious, energetic, the type to raise her hand even when she wasn't sure of the answer, the type who made the classroom feel more alive than it would have been without her. She had grown up in Carroll County, the kind of kid who knew the trails and the creeks and the back roads the way small-town kids do, from years of just being outside and paying attention to the landscape around her. She knew Deer Creek. She had been to the bridge before. Liberty German was 14, a grade ahead. Everyone called her Libby. She was the kind of teenager who documented her life the way kids in 2017 did. Snapchat, Instagram, a running visual diary of ordinary moments that felt worth saving. A photo of a friend, a view from a trail, a plate of food at a family dinner. Nothing dramatic, just life, recorded in real time on a phone that fit in her jacket pocket, the same phone she carried everywhere, the same phone that would become the most important piece of evidence in a murder investigation. Libby had a large extended family in the Delphi area, the kind of family where cousins are as close as siblings, and Sunday dinners involve more people than will fit comfortably around one table. She was known in her community not as a face in a crowd, but as a specific, particular person, someone people were glad to see when she walked in. The two girls were close friends, the kind of close that meant spending a free day together, required no planning, no deliberation, just a text and a time, and the assumption that of course they'd spend it together. Libby's grandfather, Mike Patty, dropped them off at the northern trailhead of the Monon High Bridge Trail at around 1:30 in the afternoon. He planned to pick them up a few hours later at a different access point, a short drive away on the other side of the trail. It was an arrangement that made sense. The trail was familiar. The area was familiar. He had no reason to feel anything other than ordinary about the afternoon. He watched them walk toward the trailhead, and then he drove away. Delphi sits in Carroll County, about 60 miles north of Indianapolis, in the flat agricultural middle of Indiana, where the towns are small and spaced wide apart, and the landscape in February is all bare fields and skeletal tree lines, and the occasional grain elevator breaking the horizon. The Monon High Bridge Trail runs along a former railroad corridor that had been converted into a recreational path years earlier, part of a broader effort to repurpose the old Monon Railroad right-of-way that once connected Chicago to Louisville through the Indiana interior. The bridge itself, a steel truss trestle crossing Deer Creek, had been a local landmark for as long as anyone in the area could remember, the kind of structure that shows up in local history books and family photo albums and the backgrounds of graduation pictures. It is not an official park with rangers and posted hours and emergency call boxes. It is the kind of place people go because it's there, because it's beautiful in a rough industrial way, because the view from the middle of that bridge, 60 feet above the water, with the creek winding through the bare winter trees below, is the kind of view that makes you stop walking and just look. The timber planks of the walkway are weathered and uneven, worn smooth in the center by years of foot traffic. The iron of the trestle is streaked with rust, the bolts dark with age, the whole structure carrying the weight of more than a century, in a way that feels permanent and also, when you're standing on it and looking down at the water, a little precarious. It is not a manicured place. It is a wild place that people have made their own through decades of use, and it feels like it belongs to the community in a way that a maintained park never quite does. Libby posted a photo to Snapchat from the bridge at around 2:07 in the afternoon. The photo showed Abby standing on the trestle, looking out over the creek, the water visible 60 feet below through the gaps in the timber planking. The sky behind her was pale winter blue. The trees on the far bank were bare. It was a good photo, the kind of image that captures a specific moment of a specific afternoon in a way that feels worth keeping. It was the last post either girl would make. By 3:30, Libby's grandfather arrived at the pickup point on the south end of the trail. No girls. He waited by the car, watching the path, checking his phone. He called. No answer. By 4 o'clock, he had contacted other family members, and the calls started spreading outward through the network of people who knew the girls. By 5:30 that evening, the Carroll County Sheriff's Department had a formal missing persons report. By nightfall, volunteers and law enforcement officers were moving through the woods along Deer Creek with flashlights, calling names into the dark, their breath visible in the freezing air, the beams of their lights cutting through the bare underbrush, and finding nothing. The temperature dropped below 25 degrees overnight. The creek, running shallow and cold over a rocky limestone bed, made a sound that carried through the bare trees, a low, constant murmur that filled the silence between the searchers' calls. The search resumed at first light on February 14th, Valentine's Day. The irony of that date would not be lost on anyone who followed this case in the years that followed. The red hearts in the drugstore windows, the boxes of chocolate on the counter at the gas station, the holiday that the rest of the country was observing, while Carroll County searched its woods for two missing girls. By early afternoon, search teams found the bodies of both Abby Williams and Libby German in a wooded area south of the bridge, close to the creek bank, partially concealed by the terrain and the overgrowth along the water's edge. The Carroll County Sheriff, Tobe Leesenby, confirmed the deaths publicly that afternoon in a brief statement delivered in the parking lot of the Delphi United Methodist Church, which had been established as the command post for the search operation. The statement gave away very little. The cause of death was not released. The Indiana State Police took over as the lead investigating agency within hours of the discovery. The FBI was notified and had agents on the ground before the end of the day. By evening, the area around the trailhead had been cordoned off with crime scene tape, and the trail that the community had walked for years was closed indefinitely. And then investigators examined Libby German's phone, and the case changed shape entirely. What they found on that phone was not something anyone had anticipated. Libby had activated the video function, deliberately or instinctively, in a moment of fear or calculation or both. It is impossible to say with certainty, and captured several seconds of footage. In that footage, a man is visible walking across the bridge toward the girls. He is wearing a blue jacket, jeans, and a cap pulled low over his face. His hands are in his pockets. His posture is unhurried, almost casual, the posture of a man who has decided something and is not in a hurry about it. His face is partially visible, enough to work with, enough to build a composite from. And on the audio track, in a tone that investigators would later describe as low and commanding, a voice says two words, "Down the hill." Two words, spoken on a bridge over a frozen creek in Carroll County, Indiana, on a Monday afternoon in February, recorded on a teenager's phone in the last minutes of her life. Those two words would be played on national television, analyzed by linguists, listened to by millions of people, dissected in online forums and academic papers and podcast episodes, and remain at the center of a criminal investigation for the next 6 years. The voice was distinctive, a flat Midwestern register, not loud, not hurried, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Investigators listened to it hundreds of times. They played it for people. They asked, "Do you recognize this voice?" And for years, no one who heard it said yes with enough certainty to matter. Within days of the discovery, the Indiana State Police released still images captured from that video. They also released the audio clip. They asked the public for help, identifying the man they were calling Bridge Guy. The images spread across every platform that existed in early 2017. Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, local news websites, national cable news. The audio clip was played on CNN, on Fox News, on NBC. The ISP set up a dedicated tip line and a dedicated email address. Within a week, the Delphi murders were not a local story anymore. They were a national story, the kind that generates its own momentum, its own community of followers, its own parallel investigation running alongside the official one in real time on the internet. And the tips started coming in, thousands of them, then tens of thousands. What followed over the next several years was one of the most publicly visible cold case investigations in recent American history, and one of the most frustrating to watch from the outside. The Indiana State Police, working alongside the Carroll County Sheriff's Department and the FBI, received tips that numbered in the tens of thousands. The ISP would later confirm the figure exceeded 40,000 individual tips over the course of the investigation. Investigators ran down leads in Indiana, in neighboring states, and eventually across the country. They held press conferences at intervals that were unusual for an active homicide case, releasing additional information about the suspect's physical description. Approximately 5 feet 6 to 5 feet 10 inches tall, heavy build, believed to be between 40 and 60 years old at the time of the crime, with a distinctive gait visible in the video footage, a slightly forward-leaning walk that some investigators and analysts described as deliberate and unhurried, as though the man knew exactly where he was going and was not afraid of being seen. The description was specific enough to feel actionable. It was not specific enough to produce an arrest. In 2019, 2 years after the murders, investigators released an updated composite sketch of the suspect. The new sketch looked noticeably different from the original one released in the days after the killings. The original composite had shown a younger-looking face, with softer features and a slimmer build. The 2019 sketch showed a heavier face, older, with a more pronounced jaw and deeper-set eyes, the face of a man in his 50s, rather than his 30s or 40s. Investigators explained that the update was based on new analysis and new information developed over the 2 years of the investigation. The update did not narrow the field so much as it complicated it, because now the public had 2 different images to work with, and the question of which one was more accurate became its own sustained debate in the communities of people following the case online, where every detail was examined and argued over and examined again. The audio clip remained one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in the public domain throughout this period. Amateur investigators on Reddit threads that ran to thousands of posts, on dedicated Facebook groups with tens of thousands of members, on true crime podcasts and YouTube channels that built entire audiences around the Delphi case, spent years trying to identify the voice. Linguistics professors were consulted. Regional accent analysis was applied. People submitted names, hundreds of names, then thousands, each one accompanied by a rationale, a comparison, a reason why this particular person matched the voice on the recording. The ISP confirmed publicly that they had received tips naming thousands of individuals and that they had investigated and cleared the vast majority of them. The investigative team assigned to the case at the ISP's post in Lowell, Indiana, worked the tips in rotation, prioritizing by geography and physical match, running each one to ground before moving to the next, an exhausting and methodical process that produced no arrest, through 2017, 2018, 2019, or 2020. The case developed a particular and painful character during these years. The character of a case where the evidence was visible to everyone, where the man who had committed the crime had been photographed and recorded in the act of approaching his victims, where his voice existed in a digital file that anyone with an internet connection could listen to in 30 seconds, and where none of that was translating into an arrest. The man on that bridge was right there on the screen every time someone opened the ISP's website or searched for the case. His voice was on the recording. His face was in the composite. And he was still out there, somewhere, living a life that continued while the investigation turned in circles around him, while the families of 2 murdered girls waited for an answer that didn't come. In April 2019, the Carroll County prosecutor at the time, Nicholas McClelland, made a statement that stood out from the others. He said that investigators believed the suspect was likely from the Delphi area, likely knew the trail, and likely still lived within the region. It was a notable thing to say publicly, a deliberate narrowing of geography that suggested the investigation had developed a working profile, even if a name had not yet been confirmed. It was also, in retrospect, a statement that pointed directly toward where the investigation was eventually going, toward a man who had been living in Delphi the entire time, who had continued walking through the same small town where he had killed 2 children, who had continued going to work and buying groceries and existing in the community that had spent years looking for him. Then the investigation went quiet in a way that unsettled people who had been following it closely. There were no major public updates through most of 2020. The pandemic complicated everything. Court systems, law enforcement logistics, the basic mechanics of conducting in-person interviews, and executing search warrants in a world where every interaction carried new risks. But even accounting for all of that, the silence felt heavy. By 2021, the case had been open for 4 years. Libby German's family gave interviews on the anniversary of the murders, sitting in living rooms and speaking carefully to cameras about what it meant to have 4 years pass without an answer. Abby Williams' family gave interviews. Both families expressed frustration with the pace of the investigation in terms that were careful and measured, clearly aware that anything they said publicly could affect proceedings they didn't fully have visibility into. But the weight of 4 years without an answer was audible in every word they chose. Libby's grandmother, Becky Patty, who had been one of the most visible family members in public statements, spoke about the difficulty of not knowing, about the way uncertainty compounds grief rather than suspending it, about how every anniversary arrives not as a marker of time passing, but as a reminder that the question is still open. There were rumors circulating in the true crime community, as there always are in cases like this, about specific individuals who had been looked at by investigators. Some names had been floated publicly, investigated by amateur researchers, and posted in forums and comment sections with photographs and timelines and elaborate theories. The Indiana State Police made periodic statements asking the public not to harass individuals who had not been charged with anything. At least one person who had been publicly named as a suspect by online communities had not been charged and had, by all available information, been cleared by investigators. The danger of mass public attention running parallel to an active investigation was becoming visible in real time. A community of people who genuinely wanted justice for 2 murdered girls, generating noise that could obscure the signal investigators were trying to follow, who sometimes cause real harm to real people in their pursuit of an answer they didn't have the authority or the tools to actually find. In the fall of 2022, something changed. Investigators executed a search warrant at a property in Delphi connected to a man named Richard Allen. Allen was 50 years old. He had lived in Delphi for years, not far from the trail, within a few miles of the trailhead where Libby's grandfather had dropped the girls off on the afternoon of February 13th, 2017. He worked at a CVS pharmacy on the main road through town, a job that put him in contact with the same community members who had been grieving Abby and Libby for 5 years, who had attended the vigils and signed the petitions and shared the composite sketches on their Facebook pages. He was, by all external appearances, an entirely ordinary man, a middle-aged guy with a job and a house and a life that looked like the lives of thousands of other people in small Indiana towns. Not someone whose name had circulated in the true crime forums, not someone who had appeared in any of the public discussions about the case, not someone who had drawn attention to himself in any way that the community could later point to and say they should have known. He was the kind of person who could walk through a small town every day for 5 years after committing a crime in that same small town and remain invisible to everyone looking. The search of Allen's property in October 2022 yielded evidence that led directly to his arrest. On October 26, 2022, 5 years, 8 months, and 13 days after the murders of Abigail Williams and Liberty German, Richard Matthew Allen was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder in the first degree. He was taken into custody without incident at his home in Delphi. Carroll County Sheriff Tobe Leesenby, the same man who had stood in that church parking lot in February 2017 and confirmed the deaths of 2 children, announced the arrest that afternoon. By evening, it was the top story on every national news outlet. The ISP held a press conference. The families were notified before the public announcement, a small mercy, a chance to hear the name before the rest of the world did. After 5.5 years, there was a name. The man on the bridge had a name. The probable cause, affidavit filed with the charges, contained details that had not been made public before, and they were specific in ways that mattered. Among the evidence described in the document, an unspent bullet found near the bodies of the 2 girls, which forensic analysis had matched to a specific firearm, a .40 caliber semi-automatic pistol registered to Richard Allen. The match was made through tool marks left on the cartridge by the action of the specific gun that had cycled it. This kind of evidence is precise and particular in a way that is worth understanding. When a semi-automatic pistol cycles around, when the slide moves back and forward, chambering or ejecting a cartridge, it leaves microscopic marks on the brass casing. The extractor leaves marks where it grips the rim. The ejector leaves marks where it strikes the case. The feed ramp leaves marks as the round moves into the chamber. Those marks are as individual as fingerprints, specific to the particular weapon that made them, the result of tiny manufacturing variations and patterns of wear that differ from gun to gun, even within the same make and model. Investigators had recovered that unspent round near the crime scene in February 2017 and held it for years while they looked for the weapon it came from. When they found Allen's .40 caliber pistol during the October 2022 search and ran the forensic comparison, the marks aligned. The affidavit also stated that Allen had told investigators he had been on the Monon High Bridge Trail, on the afternoon of February 13th, 2017. He had walked the trail. He had crossed the bridge. He had passed 2 girls. He had placed himself at the scene, in his own words, on the afternoon of the murders. It was a statement that could not be walked back, a concession that removed the possibility of the simplest defense, that he simply hadn't been there. Investigators also noted in the affidavit that Allen's physical description was consistent with the description of the man in Libby's video: the blue jacket, the build, the approximate height and age range. When investigators showed the video footage to people who knew Allen, multiple individuals said the person in the footage looked like him. The gait, the posture, the way the figure moved across the bridge with that unhurried, deliberate quality. It was consistent with the man they knew. The arrest did not close the case. It opened a new chapter, one that would prove nearly as complicated as the investigation itself. Allen was held initially in the Carroll County Jail, but within weeks, he was transferred to the Westville Correctional Facility, a maximum security state prison in LaPorte County, approximately 90 miles northwest of Delphi, due to concerns about his safety and about his mental and emotional condition in a local facility where the case was intensely personal to every officer and inmate and staff member who encountered him. His attorneys, initially public defenders, later private counsel, would describe his condition in custody as deteriorating over the months that followed. Reports emerged that Allen had made statements to correctional officers and to other inmates about the case while he was held at Westville. His defense team would later argue in pretrial motions that those statements had been obtained under conditions that made them unreliable and potentially coercive, that a man in psychological distress in a maximum security prison was not a man capable of making voluntary and knowing statements that could be used against him at trial, and that the materials should not be admitted as evidence. The legal proceedings that followed moved through a series of delays and disputes that stretched through 2023 and into 2024. Defense attorneys filed motions challenging the evidence. There were extended disputes over discovery, specifically over what evidence the prosecution was required to share with the defense, in what form, and on what timeline. There were hearings that generated their own news cycles, continuances that pushed the trial date back again and again, rulings that each side characterized as victories or setbacks, depending on which side was speaking. The case generated a significant volume of procedural litigation before a single witness had testified at trial. One of the more unusual developments came in late 2023, when sealed documents from the case, materials that had been placed under court seal and were not supposed to be publicly available, were leaked and began circulating online. The leaked documents contained details about the investigation and about the evidence that had not been released through official channels, details that spread rapidly through the true crime community and into mainstream news coverage. The source of the leak was not immediately identified. The presiding judge, Francis Gull, issued a gag order covering attorneys, investigators, law enforcement personnel, and other parties to the case. She later recused herself from the proceedings after aspects of the leak situation became entangled with questions about who had access to the sealed materials and how they had moved from the court's files to the internet. A new judge was assigned. The trial date was pushed back again. The case that had taken 6 years to produce an arrest was now consuming years of pretrial litigation, and the families who had waited so long for a verdict were waiting still. Through all of it, Richard Allen maintained his innocence. His defense team argued that the evidence against him was circumstantial and had been overstated, that the bullet evidence had been misinterpreted or was less definitive than the prosecution claimed, and that the investigation had suffered from a form of tunnel vision. That once Allen became the focus of the inquiry, investigators had stopped seriously pursuing other possibilities. They raised questions about other individuals who had been in the area on the afternoon of February 13th, 2017, and had never been fully accounted for. They argued that the pretrial process had been tainted in ways that made a fair trial difficult to guarantee, that the leaks and the gag order and the judicial recusal had created conditions in which their client could not receive the impartial proceeding the Constitution required. These were not frivolous arguments. They were the arguments of attorneys who believed, or at least argued, that the case against their client was not as solid as the prosecution maintained, and they pressed every available procedural and evidentiary avenue in making that case. The trial of Richard Allen began in October 2024, held in Wabash County, Indiana, approximately 40 miles southeast of Delphi. The venue had been moved from Carroll County due to the intense local attention the case had received over 7 years. The argument being that finding an impartial jury in the county where the murders had occurred and where Allen had lived and worked was not a realistic possibility, that every potential juror in Carroll County had either known the girls, known their families, known Allen himself, or spent years following the case closely enough to have formed opinions that could not be set aside. The proceedings were not televised, but detailed daily reporting from journalists inside the courtroom provided the public with a near continuous account of the testimony and the evidence as it was presented. The courtroom in Wabash County was full every day. The hallways outside it were full. People drove from Delphi to sit in the gallery, to be present for the thing they had been waiting 7 years to see. The prosecution's case was built on several interlocking pieces. The unspent bullet and its forensic link to Allen's registered .40 caliber pistol, Allen's own statement placing himself on the trail that afternoon. Physical evidence recovered from the crime scene that investigators said connected Allen to the specific location where the girls were found. And the video, Libby German's footage from the bridge, which prosecutors argued was consistent with Allen's appearance, his build, his gait, his clothing on that day. They walked the jury through the evidence methodically, piece by piece, constructing an argument that each individual element was significant, and that together they formed a coherent and complete picture of what had happened on February 13th, 2017. The lead prosecutor, Nick McClellan, the same Carroll County prosecutor who had stood at a podium in 2019 and told the public that the suspect likely still lived in the Delphi area, presented the case himself. He had been with it from the beginning. He knew every detail of it. That familiarity showed. The defense challenged each of those points in turn. They argued the bullet evidence was not as definitive as the prosecution claimed, and that the forensic methodology used to match it to Allen's weapon had limitations that the jury needed to understand. That toolmark analysis, while accepted in courts, carries a margin of uncertainty that the prosecution had not adequately disclosed. They questioned the reliability of identifying a specific individual from a few seconds of low-resolution video footage taken on a consumer smartphone in 2017. They raised the question of whether other individuals who had been in the area that day had been fully and rigorously investigated, or whether the investigation had narrowed its focus prematurely after Allen became a person of interest. They asked the jury to consider whether the evidence proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, or whether it proved only that Richard Allen had been in the same place on the same afternoon as two girls who were later found murdered. On October 31st, 2024, Halloween, a date with its own grim resonance, the jury returned its verdict after less than a day of deliberations. Richard Allen was found guilty on both counts of murder in the first degree. The foreman read the verdict in a courtroom that had gone completely silent. Outside the courthouse, people who had been waiting in the cold for hours heard the news on their phones and stood there in the October air and felt something that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but some combination of both that doesn't have a clean name. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of 65 years in prison. Given his age at sentencing, 52 years old, the mathematics of the sentence were straightforward. He would need to serve a minimum of 85% of each term before becoming eligible for parole consideration. In practical terms, it was a life sentence. He would not leave prison as a free man. He would die there. The verdict brought a response that was complicated, as verdicts in long-running and heavily scrutinized cases tend to be. Libby German's family and Abby Williams' family both spoke publicly in the hours after the conviction was announced. They expressed relief that a verdict had been reached, relief that was real and visible and hard-won after 7 years of waiting, 7 years of anniversaries and press conferences and tips that led nowhere, and composite sketches and a voice on a recording that no one could place. They expressed grief that was unchanged by the verdict, grief that had been present since February 14th, 2017, and that would continue to be present regardless of what happened in a courtroom in Wabash County. They thanked the investigators, the prosecutors, the community members who had kept the case alive through years of silence and uncertainty. They asked quietly and clearly for privacy to grieve without cameras pointed at them. Some people who had followed the case closely over the years were not fully at rest after the verdict. The questions raised by the defense about the completeness of the investigation, about whether every lead had been followed to its end, about the circumstances under which Allen made certain statements while in custody at Westville. Those questions did not disappear when the foreman read the verdict. They exist in the space that almost every major criminal conviction creates, the space where the official answer and the full truth may not be exactly the same shape, where the legal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt and the human need for complete understanding are not always the same thing. Richard Allen's attorneys have indicated they intend to appeal the conviction, citing the evidentiary disputes and the procedural complications of the pretrial period. As of this writing, no appeal has been decided, and the conviction stands. What is not in question is the evidence that Libby German left behind on that bridge. A 14-year-old girl, in the last minutes of her life, had the presence of mind, or the instinct, or something that can only be called courage, because there is no other word for it, to activate her phone's camera and point it at the man walking toward them across the trestle. She could not have known in any complete sense what she was doing or what it would mean. She could not have known that the footage would survive the afternoon, that it would be recovered by investigators, that it would be analyzed frame by law enforcement and shared with the public and become the defining image of the case. For 6 years, she just pressed record. In the cold above Deer Creek, 60 feet above the water, with the bare trees on the banks below and the pale February sky above, she pressed record and held the phone steady. That footage was the reason this case stayed open when it might have gone cold entirely within the first year. It was the reason the public stayed engaged through 5 years of silence and frustration, through the years when the tips dried up and the composites seemed to lead nowhere, and the investigation went quiet in ways that felt like giving up. It was the reason investigators kept working when there was nothing new to announce, and no arrest to show for 40,000 tips and hundreds of thousands of hours of investigative work. The bridge, the blue jacket, the low voice carrying across the frozen water. Down the hill. 2 words that Libby German made sure the world would hear. She gave investigators everything they needed to find him. It took them 6 years to close the distance. The Monon High Bridge Trail remains open. People still walk it, still cross the old trestle over Deer Creek, still stop in the middle to look down at the water 60 feet below. Some go there because it's a genuinely beautiful trail, the kind of place that reminds you why people in flat states build their lives around the few places where the land does something interesting. Some go there because of what happened on it, because they want to stand in the place where the story happened and feel something they can't fully articulate. The bridge still stretches over the creek, the same rusted iron and weathered timber it was on February 13th, 2017. The water still runs below it, cold and shallow over the limestone rocks, making the same sound it made that afternoon. A low, constant sound that carries through the bare trees and doesn't change with the seasons or the years. The Carroll County community has established memorials in both girls' names. Scholarship funds that send students to college every year in their memory, students who were in elementary school when Abby and Libby were killed and are now old enough to graduate and go out into the world that those 2 girls never got to see. Annual remembrances at the trailhead, where people gather each February 13th in the cold to stand together and say the names out loud. The kind of things that towns do when they lose children and need somewhere to put the grief that doesn't diminish with time, that needs a place to go, that isn't just silence. Abigail Williams was 13 years old. Liberty German was 14. They went for a walk on a free Monday afternoon in February, on a trail they had walked before, in a town where everyone knew their names. They did not come home. Their names are the ones that matter in this case, not the name of the man convicted of killing them, not the name of the lead detective, not the name of the prosecutor who stood up in that Wabash County courtroom and made the argument that finally put someone in front of a jury. Abby and Libby, 2 girls from Delphi, Indiana, who deserved a completely ordinary afternoon and did not get one. If this case stayed with you, the evidence that almost wasn't recovered, the 6 years of silence, the verdict that came just before it might have been too late. There's another case on this channel that ran a similar course. A community that waited longer than anyone should have to wait. A piece of evidence that changed everything when it finally surfaced. A trial that almost didn't happen. It's already there. It'll be waiting when you're ready.